Now we're on Daf Lamed Dalet in base. The Edim roim oso mibachutz. My. The Edim saw that there was money that was given over from Reuven to Shimon, but they saw it from the outside. And therefore, they don't know any of the details here. So what's going to be the din in such a case? The Nitba claims, I never got any money. The Edim say, we saw that you received money. Omle Rav Hamnuna. Rav Hamnuna has, I can answer your question, Rav Yehuda, either this way or that way, depending upon the reality. What exactly is the Nitba claiming? If he says, he can't say that he never got the money from Reuven, because if Shimon says that, he's a kafran. That means he's a no good liar, and we could never accept any of his claims or counterclaims in a bezdin. But Iomer in Shakli, but Vididi Shakli, if he says, I did receive money from Reuven, but it was mine. Either he paid me back a loan or he gave me a gift. Is then Kiyosu Edim I have? What? So again, the Edim say exactly what the Nitba says, that the money was handed over. But so what? It was given as a gift. Amalei, so Rav Hamnuna, Rabbi Yehuda responds to Rav Hamnuna, he gives him a yashikoyach. He says to him, Hamnuna at ulta. You can come to the base measures. You've proven yourself with your excellent, perceptive, and sharp analysis. Hahu diamalei l'chavim. One, we'll call him Reuven, says to Shimon, Mana manisi l'cha b'tzad amud zeh. We were standing over here in this location next to this pillar, and I lent you a money. Pay it back. Omar lo, Shimon responds, Lo avarti b'tzad amud zeh. I didn't even pass this pillar. How could I have gotten money from you? Also, Sadi asidu beida hashtin mayim b'tzad amud zeh. At Gepisht, next to this Amud. So he's a liar when he says he didn't go past the Amud. But again, the Edom don't know that he got money over there. It's on Reish Lakish, Huchsa Kafra, the very fact that he said that I didn't pass by this pillar, and we know that he's lying, that means a Huchsa Kafra, we could never accept his claims. So the Gemara doesn't like this, Rabbi Reish Lakish. Maskif Flora of Nachman, Hai Dina Parso. Maybe in the Persian system of justice you can accept that logic, but not in a Jewish system. Mi Kamer Me Olam. He didn't say I never passed in my whole life. I never passed the pillar. I never got to the pillar and received money from it. But Ikadiyami, others say that he claimed I never in my whole life went by that pillar. Never in my life did I pass through this. And Nafkule Sadi, now the Tofea comes and produces two witnesses. The Hishtin Mayim B'Tzad Omid Omarav Nachman Huchsa Kafran. He's a Huchsa Kafran because when he says he never ever passed that pillar, and we have Adam that he did, then he's a liar. But again, what are you saying? The Adam was saying that he gepished there, but next to the Omer. Maybe he didn't, he didn't make a mental note of it. That when you got a pish, you don't make a. But where did I? Was it this? Normally, Ravler of Nachman called Milsil or Rami Alei Dinish Ovid level Avadai. The person doesn't pay attention when there's no reason to pay attention. What difference it make in a million years whether he pitched here? He doesn't pay attention to it. So when he says, "I never passed by this pillar," it doesn't mean anything. He's not a Huchsa Kaf. Okay, now we get to the main sugya for today. Rabbi Shimon Omer, Chayav Kan v'Chayav B'Pikod. So how do we know that Shavuos Eidus only applies to a monetary case? And we know it from a Kal V'Chomer from Shavuos HaPikodon. Right? We said over and over again that Shavuos HaPikodon, the Torah says explicitly it's a monetary case. And if the Torah limited the chiyuv of Shavuos HaPikon, which is more chomer than Shavuos Eidus, and how much more so in Shavuos Eidus, we have that limitation. And mechku Allah b'marov. So in Eretz Yisrael, when they heard this Kal V'chomer of Shimon, they laughed at it. My chucha. What were they laughing about? And that's going to be the balance of our Daf Yomi today. What exactly were they making fun of? So first the Gemara assumes, the Katani, it says in the name of Rav Shimon, that this Kal V'chomer is not a valid Kal V'chomer, because Ma'alu Pikon Shekain Lo Osebo Mushpa Kenishba Mezid Kishoge. The Torah is more makil in Shavuos HaPikon vis-a-vis Shavuos Eidus, because in Shavuos Eidus you chayav even in Mushba Mipi Acherim, whereas in Shavuos HaPikon you're only chayav if you yourself took the Shavuos. Secondly, in Shavuos Eidus you're chayav even if you were a mezid, whereas in Shavuos HaPikon you're only chayav if you're a shogeg. So the Gemara now is going to explain why they laughed at that. Michdi, let's analyze this. Mushma mipi atzmo, bi edus, l'Reb Shimon minole. From whence does Reb Shimon know that? Because the Torah in Shavuos HaEdus only speaks about Mushma mipi acheret. And it doesn't say anything in the parsha that about a case where he took the shvuah, or he said amen to the shvuah of the mashbiah. It must be the gomer pikadon that he derives it from Shavuos HaPikadon. If Shavuos HaPikadon is chayiv when he himself took the shvuah, that's the whole parsha of Shavuos HaPikadon. Then how much more so in Shavuos HaEdus he's chayiv if he took the shvuah himself? Pikadon nami mushba mipi acherim nigmar. Why not? Just 1 second. Why not derive it the other way around? So you have to add something here to the Gemara. The Gemara at this point is relying on techta, not just on the Kal V'chomer, because Rabbi Shimon actually slugs up that power of Kal V'chomer because there are chumras in Shavuos Eidus that don't apply to Shavuos HaPikadon. But we can learn dinim one way or the other. Until now, we've been learning dinim from Shavuos HaPikadon to Shavuos HaEdus to limit it to monetary cases. Now we're going to learn from Shavuos HaEdus to Shavuos HaPikadon through this Gzeir Shava of techta that Shavuos HaPikadon should be chayiv on Mushba Mipi Acherim. So again, let's just go over the Gemara's logic now. If Mushma Mipi Atzmo, in the case of Shavuos HaEdus, is derived from Shavuos HaPikadon, why don't we do it the other way around? And let's derive Mushma Mipi Acherim from Eidus to Pikadon. And therefore we're left with a mockery. My chucha. So Gemara says that's not a valid mockery. Dilma Rabbi Shimon Kal V'chomer ma'asile. Maybe Rabbi Shimon is relying totally on a Kal V'chomer. And that is Mipi Acherim Chayim Mipi Atzmo L'Koshken, has nothing to do with Shavuos HaPikadon. Internally, in Shavuos HaEdus, we know that Mushba Mipi Atzmo is Chayim, because if the Torah says Mushba Mipi Acherim is Chayim, then certainly Mushba Mipi Atzmo is Chayim. So you have no right to say that, well, Rabbi Shimon derived Mushba Mipi Atzmo in Shavuos HaEdus from Pikadon, and therefore you should derive Shavuos Mipi Acherim from Eidus to Pikadon. That's not so. He never derived the conclusion that Shavuos Eidus is Chayv Mipi Atzmo based on a comparison to, or a Kal V'chomer from Shavuos HaPikadon, but rather he derived it from Shavuos Eidus itself. If in Shavuos Eidus is Chayv Mipi Acherim, certainly it's Chayv Mipi Atzmo. Ella. So now we have to find another justification for the mockery. Chucha mezid kishogeg. What is Reb Shimon assuming? He's assuming that whereas Shavuos HaEdus is chayav even for mezid, Shavuos HaPikadon is not chayav for mezid. The Katani, right? The Brisa says in the name of Reb Shimon Malapikon shekain loasa bo mushba v'yome mushba kirishba and mezik yishogeg. So now the Gemara is going to show us that there's a mockery here. There's an inconsistency. Why is it that Shavuos Ha'edus is chayav even if he was a mazid? And that same reasoning should apply to Shavuos HaPikadon. Michti. Mazid nami edus minolon. How do you know in Shavuos Ha'edus is chayav for mazid? The loksiv ve'vanel on the Torah omitted the word venelam, which appears in the Parsha Shavuos Habitui, to tell me that Shavuos Habitui is talking about a case of shogeg, but by contrast, in the case of Shavuos Ha'edus, it doesn't say the word for nelam, and therefore he's chayiv even for mezid. Is hachanami here too in Shavuos HaPikadon lo ksiv be'venelam. So why does Reb Shimon come to the conclusion that in the case of Shavuos HaPikadon you're only chayiv if you were a shogeg but not a mezid? The same by the virtue of the same reasoning that you derive that Shavuos Ha'edus is chayiv even for a mezid because of the absence of the word venelam. Well, guess what? In Shavuos HaPikadon, also the word venelam is missing. And the Gemara rejects it. That's not a valid justification for making fun of Reb Shimon's derivation. Amaluhu Rav Huna Maichucha. Why is that? Mockery. Dilma Mezid. Dilav Kishogeg Mipikadon. Why is it that in the case of Shavuos HaPikadon, despite the absence of the word venelam, we're still going to limit Shavuos HaPikadon to a case of shogeg and not apply to mezid? That's because of a gzeira shava between Shavuos HaPikadon and me'ilah. Me'ilah Rav Shimon Gomar La. Now, in me'ilah, the Torah says umal amal. And in the Shavuos HaPikadon, likewise, it says umal amal. So Rav Shimon is going to say that just like in me'ilah, you're only chayiv for a shogeg. That's the korban me'ilah, what's called an asham me'ilah. So too, by virtue of the gzeira shava of umal mal, in the case of Shavuos HaPikadon, you're only chayiv for a shogeg. So the Gemara says that doesn't make any sense. Hainu chucha. That's what they were making fun of. You have Shavuos HaPikadon. You're trying to figure out if Shavuos HaPikadon is chayiv for mezid, and he brings the korban. You have two possible ways of learning. Either you could derive it from Shavuos Ha'edus, and therefore you come to the conclusion that he's chayiv even b'mezid, or you derive from me'ilah, and you come to the conclusion that he's not chayiv b'mezid. It's only chayiv b'shogeg. So Gemara says it's chukah. Well, what do you mean? He's going to derive it from me'ilah? That doesn't make any sense. He should derive it from Shavuos Ha'edus. Now, what's the underlying logic over here? We go back to techta. Remember, we had Gzeir Shavi equating Shavuos Ha'edus with Shavuos HaPikadon, and that should therefore trump the Mola Mal Gzeir Shavi. So the Gemara says, Mistavro Me'ilah Havil Melech. No. That's not a reason for chucha. That doesn't justify the mockery. There's a compelling logic to equate Shavuos HaPikadon to Me'ilah. Why is that? She came Me'ilah Me'ilah. Right? In both cases, there's a kind of me'ilah, meaning what happened in Shavuos HaPikadon? Ruvain deposited his object in the hands of Shimon, and Shimon went ahead and took it for himself. That's called misappropriation. That's called me'ilah. And that's what happened in Hegdish. And therefore, the Gemara says, I understand Rabbi Shimon in equating Shavuos HaPikadon to me'ilah and coming to the conclusion that Shavuos HaPikadon is only chayav in a case of shogeg. So the Gemara says, Adarabba, mi edus havi leila melef, shekain techta mi techta. So that even though you have a certain striking comparison between Shvuas HaPikadon and Me'ila, because in both cases he's being accused of misappropriating, nevertheless we have a Gzeir Shava of Techta Techta, which pulls Shvuas HaPikadon towards a comparison, an analogy to Shvuas HaEdus. They both say Techta. And that's going to give justification to Reb Shimon's conclusion that Shvuas HaPikadon. Oh, no. So 1 second. Where are we holding? So wait a minute. Yeah, I'm just trying to make the calculation here. So if we have Techta Techta, then he should come to the conclusion that Shvuas HaPikadon is chayav even for Mezid. So this would be the Chucham. So Gemara says, no, if he'd rather derive it from Me'ila. And now we're going to go through the number of comparisons between Me'ila and Shvuas HaPikadon and Shvuas HaEdus and Shvuas HaPikadon. We'll see where the majority falls. Shekei Me'ila, right? It says Umala Mal. So that's the first striking comparison between Me'ila and Shvuas HaPikadon. The word Me'ila appears as an introduction to both parshas. Number 2, Bakol. Right? We're not limiting it to Ksherim, and we're not excluding Krovim or any of that. Neither in Me'ila, everybody's chayiv. Men, women, Krovim, not Krovim, whoever it is. So too in Shvuas HaPikadon, everyone's chayiv. Number 3, Nene. Right? When the Nitba claims that he doesn't have the object, when he really does, he's benefiting from the object. And that's what Me'ila is all about. Shvuas HaEdus, the Edom don't benefit one way or the other. Bekavua. Kavua means that in both cases of Shvuas HaEdus, of Shvuas HaPikadon and Me'ila, the carbon is kavua. It doesn't fluctuate and reflect the financial status of the Mischayev carbon. Chomesh, both in the case of Pikadon, Shvuas HaPikadon, and in the case of Me'ila, he adds a penalty of 20% on top. And V'asham. And both Shvuas HaPikadon and Me'ila bring a carbon asham, Asham Me'ilos. So all told, I think we have 6 comparisons here. And this would again strengthen the logic of Rabbi Shimon, proving that, like Me'ila, Shvuas HaPikadon is only b'shogeg and not b'meis. Where it says Adara, I have more reason to compare Shvuas HaPikadon to Edus rather than to Me'ila. Let's go through it. Me'edus haveh Me'ila shekain chet, right? In both cases, the Torah says ki techta. So we have the Gzeir Shava of techta techta. Number 2, hedjot. Right? We're not talking about property owned by Hegdish. We're talking about property owned by an individual ordinary citizen. Number 3, b'shvua. That's the most striking comparison. In both Shvuas HaEdus, Shvuas HaPikadon, we're talking about shvua. In Me'ila, we're not talking about a shvua. Number 4, Taveh v'Kafre. That's also pretty impressive. Right? What is Shvuas HaPikadon if not a Tovea and a Kofer? 2 litigants, right? The plaintiff and the defendant. And the same thing is true for Edus when the plaintiff is Tovea Edus from the Edom, and he denies it. Number 5, Owen. Right? So we had the Gzeir Shava of O that appears in both Shvuas HaPikadon and in Shvuas HaEdus, and we're left with 5. So it's basically 6 versus 5. Is Hanach Nefishin. So we have more reason to compare Shavuos Hapikodon to Me'ilah than we do to Shavuos Eidos. Hence, Shavuos Hapikodon does not apply in the case of Mason. So we have no justification for mocking Rabbi Shimon. Ella, says the Gemara, Chucha, Ki also Rav Papa. Rav Huna Braid Rav Yeshua Midbei Rav Amri, they said, Hainu Chucha, what is the mockery michti? Rav Shimon Gzeres Shava Gamir. Rav Shimon has Gzeres Shava, which I assume means Techta Techta. Let's see if I'm right. Correct. Is Lama Le de Parach. What was the whole Pircha the Kalvachomer? In which he said, no, I'm going to prove to you that Shavuos Eidos is more chomer than Shavuos HaPikadon. Forget about all that. Drop that all. Once you have a Gzeres Shava, then you don't need the Kal V'chomer, and you don't need to slug up the Kal V'chomer. So if we assume that Reb Shimon has the Gzeres Shava of Techta Techta, then hands down we have to accept the equation, and therefore we come to the conclusion that in Shavuos HaPikadon should be Chai for Mezid. So what was the whole business of Reb Shimon saying, well, Kal V'chomer, and the Kal V'chomer itself was rejected because in Shavuos Eidos he's chayiv for Mezid, whereas in Shavuos HaPikadon he's not chayiv for Mezid. Why don't you say that in Shavuos HaPikadon he should also be chayiv for Mezid based on the Gzeres Shava Techta Techta? So Gemara again rejects it. My chucha dilma ki parch mikami to take him like Gzeres Shava basel kami take lo parach. When Reb Shimon in his original logical analysis and he dissected, he was operating with a Kal V'chomer, and therefore he slugged up the Kal V'chomer by saying there's a pircha because Shavuos HaPikadon is kal, where Shavuos Eidos is chomer, and the reason for that is Shavuos Eidos is chayiv for Mezid, and Shavuos HaPikadon is not chayiv for Mezid. That's before he knew the Gzeres Shava. When he heard the Gzeres Shava and he accepted it, techta, then he came to the conclusion that Shavuos HaPikadon is chayiv even for Mezid. Velo, is it really so that once Rabbi Shimon accepts the Gzeres Shava of Techta Techta, he would no longer offer a pircha on the Kal V'chomer? Va'amar lehu Rava bar Itai l'Rabbanan man tana Shavuos HaPikadon lo nitan zdona lekapara Rabbi Shimon he. Now, as we see that even after Rabbi Shimon accepts the Gzeres Shava of Techta Techta, nevertheless, he insists that in the case of Shavuos HaPikadon, if he was amazed, there's no kapar, meaning there's no karma. Now, why is that so? So apparently we're stuck with, at this point, a real contradiction in Reb Shimon at this point. We're really in a question mark situation because Reb Shimon on the one hand is assuming that Shavuos HaPikadon is not chayiv for Mezid, and yet he accepts the Gzeres Shava Techta Techta to derive it from Shavuos Eidos. So our answer is Dilma Mezid Kishogeg Par. The reason why Reb Shimon came to the conclusion that there's no chiyuv karban in Shavuos HaPikadon b'Mezid is because the Gzeres Shava to Me'ilah, the Gamal Lemi Me'ilah, the Hanach Nefisha that we already established that there's more weight and similarities to push for the comparison between Shavuos HaPikadon and Me'ilah than there are to push for the comparison of Shavuos HaPikadon to Shavuos Eidos. Aval mushpa kenishpa lo par. Oh, So again, what happened after Rav Shimon accepted the Gzeira Shav of Techta Techta? He seems to have gone halfway. He accepts the equation in order to establish that Shuas HaPikadon would logically be chayav even in Mushba Mipi Acherim, but he's not willing to derive the conclusion that Shuas HaPikadon will be chayav even for Mezid, because he's being pulled in two directions. From the Gzeira Shava to Me'ila, he's going to derive the conclusion that Shuas HaPikadon is not chayav a carbon in the case of Mezid. It's only for Shogeg. But on the other hand, that Mushba Kinishba, that's halacha that we could derive from Shuas Eidus through the Gzeira Shava of Techta Techta without having to endanger or question the Gzeira Shava to Me'ila. Because again, Me'ila has nothing to do with Shavuos, so there's no difference between Mushba Mipiacher and Mushba Piatzma. So once again, it seems like the Gemara is okay with Reb Shimon, and there's no justification for the Chucha and the Makar. So the Gemara now raises the following question. Maybe this is the Makari. V'tedar edus v'tigmar lo mipikadon. I guess he's saying now that the Gzeira Shava should go two-directional. And therefore, we should derive conclusions in Shavuos HaEdus from Shavuos HaPikadon in the opposite direction. That Mezid de lav kishogeg, meaning ma Pikadon shogeg in Mezid lo, af Edus shogeg in Mezid lo. Right, you've already derived from the Gzeira Shava of Me'ila Kimal of Me'ila to Shavuos HaPikadon that you're not chayiv for Mezid. Now you have a Gzeira Shava equating Pikadon to Edus, which is called Techta Techta. So why not use that Gzeira Shava to teach you that just like Shavuos HaPikadon does not apply in the case of Mezid, so to Shavuos Edus should not apply in the case of Mezid. Ki hechi diyolef Pikadon mime'ila. I mean, in the same way that you derive conclusions in Pikadon from Me'ila, like for example, Mushba, that if he does it b'Mezid, he's not chayav, is now we should go ahead and put that into the Gzeira Shava of Techta Techta. So 1 second. Oh, beautiful. That's exactly what he says. That we should come to the conclusion, argues the Gemara, that in Shavuos HaEdus, he should be chayiv only in the case of Shogeg, not in the case of Mezid. And that's going to be derived from Techta Techta, the equation between Shavuos HaEdus and Shavuos HaPikadon. And now we're going to turn to Lamed Hey to try to get to the Mishnah. Is lahachi ksava rachmana li edus gabi shvuas bitui. Now we understand why the Torah put, to compare and contrast, shvuas edus to shvuas bitui, v'gabi tumas mikdash b'kadoshim, and the Torah juxtaposed shvuas edus right near, I think we're talking about Vayikra Perek Hey, if I'm not mistaken, near tumas mikdash v'kadoshav, because in both shvuas bitui and in tumas migdash v'kadoshav, in both cases it says v'nelam, the kulo nema b'nelam, v'kan, but here, right next to it, juxtaposed, in the case of Shavuos HaEdus, lo nema b'nelam, the Torah, in a very outstanding way, omitted the word v'nelam. Why? L'chayv ha'amezid kishogeg. So we end up with justifying Rabbi Shimon's conclusions. Okay, then, this is where we'll stop on the Mishnah on Laf Lamed Hey. Thank you so much.